Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is just a little supplementary lesson, sort of, on Chapter 6 to go over a little bit of memorization information and just kind of making sure that we put Chapter 6 and the imperfect and future in the context of the rest of our semester. So Chapter 6 goes over the imperfect and the future. The imperfect we talked about in class focuses on BA. That's why we have the memorization device of the imperfect sheep. You can see right over here, we have our sheep. He's very much imperfect. There are a lot of things imperfect about him, especially since this was made on MS Paint. So, BA. The imperfect sheep says BA because BA is the tense thing that you have to do for the imperfect. BA is universal across all conjugations. So when we talk about the third conjugation, the third IO conjugation, and the fourth conjugation, everything will go back to BA with the imperfect. The imperfect is super, super easy. There are almost no exceptions outside of the necessarily irregular verbs. And so imperfect is quite simple if you know that it uses BA. So for example, we have monero, monere, monebam, monebas, monebat, monebamos, monebatis, monebant. The imperfect is was or were ing, so I was loving, you were loving, he, she, it was loving. For amo, amare, for moneo, monere, it would be I was advising or I was warning, you were warning, he, she, it was warning, etc. That is the basis of the imperfect. Remember, and this will become important, very important for later tenses, that say monebam does not mean I advised or I warned, but I was advising or I was warning. That ing is absolutely necessary in the imperfect because it is the perfect tense, which will be just like the English past tense. This tense that we use is sort of a past progressive, so it is quite different, and we must make a note of that. So it is was or were, whatever the verb is, plus ing. We also have sum esse, which is irregular, means to be. That's these are just kind of forms you have to memorize. I will say though that they are very important to memorize. When we look at the future perfect and the pluperfect, you will need to know the imperfect and future forms of sum esse. So these must be memorized, if not for their own sake, at least for your ability to do well later in the year. You need 100% to know these. And so for the imperfect, it's eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratis, erant. Super easy, just most must isn't attached to era. That's the stem. The imperfect is a super, super, super easy tense. Even later in the year when we look at other conjugations, it's not going to give you any difficulty. The thing we should remind ourselves of, though, is that the imperfect for sum esse means a different thing in English from the imperfect for most verbs. For sum esse, the imperfect means I was, you were, he, she, it, there was, we were, you all were, they were. Right? That's different from I was being, you were being, yada, yada, yada. So it is important to note that the ing rule works for every verb except sum esse. It does not work there. Sum esse is just the past tense of to be. If we take a look at the future tense, the little rhyme that I have for the future tense is bo be boo for 1 and 2. This is because the future tense, the bo be boo pattern only works for the first and second conjugations. Later in the year when we get into the third and fourth conjugations, it will be A and E for 4 and 3. So that's our little rhyme. Bo be boo for 1 and 2, A and E for 4 and 3. But of course, we haven't learned the third and fourth conjugations yet, so you don't need to worry about that right now. But you do need to know bo be boo for 1 and 2. And bo be boo looks just like this. Amabo, amabis, amabit, amabimos, amabitis, amabunt. So it's a bo, be, boo. Sum esse is going to be a little bit different. That's going to be more like ero, eris, erit, erimus, eritis, erunt. Both of these, both the bo be boo as well as the sum esse irregular form, are integral to know. Sum esse as I said before, is going to be absolutely necessary to know other tenses. So if we don't know sum esse right now in the future tense, then you can't know the future perfect tense. It's impossible. So it does need to be memorized quite quickly. And of course, the future tense just means will do something. So amabo means I will love, amabis means you will love, amabit means he, she, it will love. Quite easy. The only other thing I'd like to go over here is that Professor Eberwein doesn't really seem to talk that much about how to conjugate something. And so there are kind of 3 steps to it. If we look over in this box on the right, conjugating has 3 steps. First, you get the stem. Second, you do the tense stuff. And third, you apply your endings. The only endings that we've learned so far are most, must, doesn't, and they will be applied to all active indicative verbs. Most, must, doesn't works for all active indicative verbs. We also have another rhyme that we'll get to later in the year for passive indicative and different things for the subjunctive and the passive subjunctive. But if we take an example on how to conjugate, so amo, amare, and we want to conjugate that in the first person plural imperfect active indicative, we first take our stem, ama, which we get from the infinitive amare, drop the re, you get ama. Then you put the imperfect bit on. What's the imperfect bit? We go back to the imperfect sheep, that says ba. So we have amaba, and then we do our active indicative ending, which is just what form of most, must, doesn't. And so because first person plural over here is mus, we get mus, and we get amabamos. And that is essentially how to conjugate. This will be important in the future because we will have some relatively, because the tense stuff and the endings will kind of get mixed around. It gets kind of difficult to tell what exactly is an ending, especially when you learn new endings for the passive, and especially when you learn different things for tense stuff. Latin has 6 tenses, and then 4 different endings for active indicative, passive indicative, active subjunctive, and passive subjunctive. So it is very important that we know to do our stem first, then the tense stuff, then the endings. And that's essentially how we're going to go into verbs. And if we know that, it becomes very, very easy. So, as we said before, the imperfect is based on BA, that's the tense stuff for the imperfect. And the future tense stuff is bo, be, boo, depending on what person and number you are looking at. And that's about all we have for chapter 6. I recommend memorizing bo, be, boo for 1 and 2, and the imperfect sheep, and you shouldn't have any problems with these 2 tenses. Alright, see you in the next one. Happy studying.